Wow. Hey, I'm Charlie. It's so cool to see everyone here. I know so many faces here from the internet, and it's so rare to see you all together in one place in real life. There's so many people doing so many cool things here. It's awesome. And thank you so much, Software Mansion, for putting on this event. They do everything really, really well, and this is like no exception. This is probably my favorite tech conference ever. I'm the CEO of Expo, and I just want to share a little bit about where Expo is now and what we've been working on, and then talk a little bit about what's happening next and where we're going. In 2022, Expo's come a long, long way from where we were the last time this conference happened before the pandemic. So now we've got every single day, we've got tens of millions of users using hundreds of thousands of different Expo apps across the entire iOS and Google app stores. And Expo, the repository, is used by 475,000 plus repositories on GitHub, and that number is probably going to cross 500,000 in a few days. And then another really cool stat is that in 2022, for the first time, more than half of the projects using React Native are now using Expo. So we've crossed that threshold from under 50% to probably above 60% this year. So Expo is becoming more popular within the React Native community, and that's really exciting. So I wanted to share a quick story about one of those apps that I was mentioning. This is Dr. Tim Spector. He's a well-known epidemiologist in the UK. And for the last couple of years, he's been studying microbiome, gut health, things like that. And so a couple of years ago, he decided to join up with some technologists and start a company called Zoe, focused on personal nutrition and figuring out what's in your gut and controlling your weight and making you healthy through that. But then COVID happened, and it changed everything. And the team had a new idea. And basically, their idea was that we need to do something to help out with COVID because that's the biggest health issue facing people today. And we've got people on our team with backgrounds in epidemiology, data science, and building technology products. There must be something we can do. And so the idea that they came up with was that they would build a symptom tracker. And the idea was basically if we can build an app that asks people how they're feeling every single day and asks what symptoms they have and what's going on, we can identify where COVID is growing and where it's sprouting up and how it's affecting people. And this is right at the beginning of COVID, so there weren't rapid tests yet. Nobody really knew what was going on, and everyone was really, really scared. No one knew how big a deal it would be or how small a deal it would be. And so this was a really good idea. And so the challenge was they said, OK, we've got to build this really, really fast because people are starting to die. Let's give ourselves 36 hours to build the most minimal of MVPs. And they did it. And what's crazy about it is they didn't have anyone on their team who's built apps before. They basically had some generalist full-stack engineers and some web engineers. But one of them had played around a little bit with Expo just to sort of experiment to see if they wanted to use it for something else related to their nutrition product. And they basically were all able to learn it and start building right away and get something really, really basic together in literally a day and a half. And they submitted it to the app stores. They submitted it to Apple and they submitted it to Google. While they were waiting for it to get reviewed over the next couple of days, they kept working on it. And they used the OTA updates from Expo to keep pushing those changes to the app as soon as they were ready. And by the time the app was sort of approved for release 4 days later, their app had gotten a whole lot better. And then 4 days later, it goes live. What's crazy was COVID was the #1 news story that week, obviously, because it was starting to become a huge thing in the world. And so their app launch actually got a ton of attention because it was probably the first COVID app out there. And the first day, they had 250,000 people sign up because they had all these press stories. And then it kind of went viral from there. And they actually went from just having an idea to literally having 1 million people using their app every single day in 1 week from beginning to end. And what's awesome to me is that's kind of why we've been working on Expo. Is so you can have an idea like that, and you can make it happen and get on both platforms and make it an actually good app and make it something that people want to use all in the span of time, literally a week. And if you think about what that would have taken if you were building with Kotlin and Swift and hiring 2 teams and the lead time on hiring those kind of people, there's no way you could have done it. And there's also, without OTA updates, they couldn't have made that app better and better and better over the course of the week and over the course of the next couple of weeks. And they couldn't have kept it as being one of the most popular apps. So there are a ton of things that are really, really important. But, as an app grows up from there, a lot of you in this room must know that that's not the story of most apps doesn't end there. And what you end up with is you sort of end up with something where you're like, okay, this is awesome, but now I want to add something more complicated to my app. Either I need some analytics that make my app, just my company uses a particular analytics product and we need a native module to track those things, or I want to do something fancy with the camera and I need to write my own camera module, or I need to use React Native Vision Camera or something. You need to add some custom native code to your app, and all of a sudden, your life would get way more complicated. And so this whole process of ejecting and adding custom native modules was really, really gnarly for people. And so what we found was that they basically we needed to do more to unlock the full power of the platforms and the full power of native apps. We just found that we were hearing from developers over and over that they didn't like to make this choice of I'm really happy with the workflow I have where I just use the Expo Go client from the app stores and I can just worry about writing React code, but I also really want to use this one native module, and now I'm stuck with, there's this fork in the road and I don't want to pick a direction. And so we basically built a set of things that we think give you the best of both worlds, and now you don't have to make that choice anymore. The first thing in this list is what we call the dev client. This is a really important piece of the puzzle, and it's basically like an Expo Go client that's just for your app. And so it's really, really similar to the Expo Go client from the App Store, but it's going to include the specific native code that's exactly what your app needs. So you can take away stuff if you don't need it, and your app can be small, and you can add whatever native modules you want. Those can be native modules that you wrote yourself or stuff from third parties. And then you get that on your device, and you can connect to it with the regular Expo dev tools, and you can develop your app in basically the same way that you're used to with Expo Go client from the App Store, but now you're using any native module you want. That is a really big deal. I'm really excited today to announce that the Expo dev client, is now in 1.0 and out of beta and ready to use by everybody. So if you're needing native modules, this is your path. The next thing, though, is people also just have a lot of trouble building stuff. Once you start needing to include custom native code, you need to do your own build. You can't just use the Expo Go client from the App Store anymore. And so what people faced in the past was they would have to get a Mac if they want to do an iOS build, or get a pretty high-powered Windows or Linux machine or Mac to do Android. And it would take a lot of time, it would take a lot of RAM, it would take a lot of hard drive space, and grind their CPU to a halt. And also, it just takes a long time to download Xcode and Android Studio. It takes a lot of work to keep those up to date. A lot of times, people would lose half a day of productivity just because they had to download a new version of one of those Xcode or Android Studios. So what we've built is what we call EAS Build, which is basically a hosted solution for building your apps. We move all that to the cloud. And what's awesome about EAS Build is it can basically do any kind of build that you need. It works across iOS and Android, and it can build a dev client. So you don't have to build a dev client yourself on your own computer. You can build it in the cloud. And so you can now, add your own native modules, build them in the cloud, and then be using a dev client to develop with whatever native code you want without needing to have a Mac, without needing to have a high-powered computer, without needing to have Xcode Android Studio on your machine. You can also use ES Build to do internal distribution builds for testing. So if you want to send something to another member of your team to look at or something like that, or you need to do a test flight build, ES Build can also handle those. And also, it can do those builds that you submit to the app stores, like your production builds. ES Build can handle all of those things. And so, this is now available, and it can handle any React Native project or Expo project. So where we're going from there is that we now can start to think of Expo as a platform. And it's basically all these libraries that people are writing. Now, we can help people make them much easier to use on Expo so that it becomes just a richer ecosystem. And the key way that we're doing that is something we call config plugins. The way that I think of config plugins is basically when you install a custom native module in a React Native project, there's usually two steps to the process. Step one is sort of npm installing that module, and then step two is reading the whole README in GitHub and following 5 or 6 different instructions where you're maybe modifying the app delegate, maybe you're modifying some JSON configuration file, maybe you're modifying some other Xcode configuration file or something like that. And there's just a bunch of steps that you usually have to do to use anything that's a very complicated native module. And so what a config plugin is it's basically a way of automating and writing an automated description of what needs to happen to make a native module work in a project. And so when you build one of these for your library, it makes it so much easier for people to use because they don't have to go follow all those steps anymore. They just have to do this one step of adding the config plugin to their project. And then the system will do it for them. So we've already seen a lot of adoption of this across the whole ecosystem. All these different libraries up here have already got config plugins written for them. And it's really easy to write these. So many more, like basically most authors of libraries in the ecosystem are already writing these. And so even though this is like a fairly new system, it's already pretty widely adopted, and we're already seeing almost 1 million weekly downloads per week of config plugins. So if you're a library author, and I see a lot of you out there, you should definitely be writing an Expo config plugin for your library, because there's so many users out there that will have so much easier of a time using this. The other really cool thing about config plugins is that they're part of the whole solution that means you don't need to eject anymore in almost every case. And the reason for that is that when you think about what ejecting does, it's basically like when you eject, you say, hey, give me the iOS directory of my project, give me the Android directory of my project, and let me take responsibility for those. And so when you do that, you get the power to do whatever you want with all that code and all those configuration files or whatever. But the downside of that is that you also take on that burden and that responsibility and all that complexity. And that's a big headache. And so the awesome thing about config plugins is you can have a project where you don't even see the Android directory or the iOS directory, but you can still install a native module that needs to make changes there, because ESBuild and the system can run the pre-build steps to actually do everything in the config plugin instructions and take care of tweaking the Android and iOS directories in the way they need to make all these native modules work together. So you can manage all that. You can have the system manage all that stuff for you. And so you basically don't need to handle this question anymore of like, what do I do with this fork in the road? Do I eject and get all this power, or do I stay in my nice, safe zone where I can just worry about writing JavaScript for the most part? Now you can basically get both. So really excited about all this, and we hope that most of you end up moving to this over time as your projects get complicated. Obviously, we're still going to support Expo Go client because that's a great way to start projects and do snacks and things like that. OK, so here's another thing that's weird to me, changing gears a little bit. Here's a graph, and it's basically showing how people use the internet, broken down on desktop versus mobile. And you can see the dark lines of the mobile thing just keep going up. And it's still going up, and maybe even accelerating. And it's basically just people are using their mobile phones more and more. I don't really need to show you this graph to convince you of that, probably. But if you just look around, you think about your own behavior, your family, whatever, all of you are probably using their mobile phones more and more every week, every year. And more things, if you played Fortnite, you probably played it on PC a couple years ago. And then if it weren't banned from the App Store, you'd be probably playing it on iPad now or something like that. Like, these things are just happening. And then what people are doing with their mobile phones is that they're using apps instead of websites. This particular study I found said that 90% of mobile time is spent in apps and only 10% is on the rest of the internet. And that's pretty congruent with what I see in my own behavior. And so the weird thing about all this, though, is if you think about what developers are doing, they're not building apps at the same rate they're building websites. Developers are still building websites all the time. Here's a graph that shows that literally 15 times as many downloads are happening for React DOM instead of React Native. And it's not just React DOM and React Native. This is just true. Think about how many native developers you know or app developers you know, and think about how many people you know who build websites all the time. We all probably know 10 times as many people that build websites somehow. And so there's this weird thing where all these people want to, people everywhere want to use apps. They want that rich behavior. They want the interactions. They want the smoothness. They want to use the full power of their devices. They want all the things that come with apps for using. But then for building, we're all still building websites for some reason, or almost all of us. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons why. Here's a list of a bunch of them. They're not all about it being too hard to build. I think we've done a really good job. All the people working on React Native, all the people working on Expo, and also even people working on stuff like Flutter, we've made it a lot easier to do just the building part of building apps. But there's all these other elements here. The biggest one in the center of this chart here is distribution. Just getting people the software you make is a huge deal. It's a huge headache. And so where we're going next with Expo is basically how can we just get rid of every one of these issues and make it so that the world comes back into balance and developers can build software the way that people want to use it, and we can all build apps. And so here's some of the ways that we're already working on that. So the first one is EAS update. That's the next version of the OTA updates that we've always had, and this is enterprise grade. It's more powerful. It handles different versions of your native runtime better, and a whole bunch of other things better. It handles lining up Git branches with your deployments and things like that. And basically what that lets you do is, like, in my mind, the most important thing here is that the best practice in web development these days is like all about continuous deployment. You make a change, it goes live seconds or minutes later. And you're just like constantly able to react to things that are going wrong or going right, or how you want to make your website better. And almost everybody using modern websites is using things like Netlify and Vercel to do this. And EAS Update is a way to do this for your mobile apps. You can make a change, and it can be live to your users a minute later. And that's awesome. You can make 100 changes a day. You don't have to wait for a 2-week release cadence or anything like that. So this is one way that chips away at the whole deployment problem. Another thing that's just like a huge, tedious pain in the butt when you're building an app is submitting to the app stores for review. Like, there are so many projects that I've built that are like a really nifty little demo. Like, I made part of a Wordle clone the other day, and I would have sent it to some friends, but submitting to the App Store probably would have taken longer than it actually took to build that app. And there's so many questions that you have to answer, and there's so many steps you have to go through. And like, there's the Play Store and the iOS App Store, and you have to submit to both. There's such a big headache here. And so part of the solution here is we built this thing called EAS Submit, which is basically a submission service. It'll help you just submit your binaries to the App Store for review. One really cool thing about it is it's integrated really well with EAS Build, which means that you can do something like, if you build an App Store build with EAS Build, you don't have to download that build artifact to your own computer and upload it again. Our servers can just send it directly to the App Store for you. There's actually an auto-submit option you can put in EAS Build that will just use EAS Submit to directly submit that build to the App Store for you. And then complementing that, today we're actually, or at least in the next release of EAS CLI, we're releasing something called EAS Metadata, the first version of it. And this basically helps you with filling out all those super annoying forms and when you're submitting your app. So like, here's one example of just like all these age rating questions. Like, one of the examples here that's sort of ridiculous is, does your app contain simulated gambling? Like, most of us have written apps in this room. Probably very few of us have written apps that use simulated gambling. But we have to go through and we have to think about these 100 different questions. It's like going to the DMV, or you don't know what that is if you're not American, but it's like getting your driver's license or dealing with one of these bureaucracies. It's really annoying and takes a ton of time and sucks all the fun and life out of the development process. So what EAS Metadata does is that we're basically trying to like standardize this, make it easier for you to have this versioned and taken care of automatically as much as possible. And so this will sort of answer all these questions in the default way, figure out if you're using modules that should be answered in unusual ways, and then keep that in sync across iOS and Android and things like that, and just help you keep that working. So in the next version of EAS CLI release, just type EAS metadata and --help, and you can see all about this. And you can find docs on our website. And then the last piece of the puzzle that I think is really, really important is basically just like web. Like, I talked a lot about like why web is so awesome to develop for all these reasons, and why apps kind of suck for all these reasons, and that's why the world is in this weird state where there's this imbalance. But part of the answer here is actually to embrace web and to just say like, hey, when people build an app, they almost always actually want a website too. And like, you see, even with the most app products, like think about like TikTok. They have a website where you can reset your password, or you can just view a video if you haven't downloaded the app yet, or even the most basic stuff out there, like maybe your app just needs a landing page that just says, go to this App Store link and download it. And so, but like most products these days, you probably want to have the same product built for iOS and Android and web. Like, if you think about what Instagram does, for example. If you go to the Instagram website, especially the mobile website, it's basically pixel for pixel the same product as their iOS app or their Android app. And that's what people want. And what's really, really cool is that like, it's already been theoretically possible to do this for a while with technologies like React Native Web and Expo Web and a bunch of other things that people have been working on. But in the last couple months and year, a bunch of progress has been made that makes this pretty reasonable, and we're seeing more and more people doing this. And we're going to invest a lot more in the next year or two, and just sort of making web a first-class citizen here, so that Expo can really target iOS, Android, and web, and give you all those solutions from a single code base. I want to give a really special shout out here to Fernando Ro, who's really been leading the charge here and making Solido, which is an awesome library. The best practice that we found is basically that with web, you need certain things like SEO, which usually comes from doing SSR. And the best way to do that right now these days is to use Next.js, which is a great library. And so a bunch of people have been doing good work to make React Native work pretty well with Next.js, and just bundle that all up together. And so we think that's the current best way to do things, and we're going to be embracing that and trying to make that work. So that's kind of gives you an idea of like where we're going. We're like, the future that we see is basically like everybody who's thinking about building a piece of software for someone should think about, I'm building an app, and it's going to be on iOS, and it's going to be native on iOS, and it's going to be native on Android, and it's going to be also native on the web to the web. And I'm going to target all these platforms instead of making this decision, oh, should I do the easy thing and build a website, or should I do like the actually good thing and build an app, or like I have this fork in the road, and forks in the road are bad. So anyway, we're really excited to see all of you here. I'm so happy to be here, and we can't wait to see what you build with Expo and React Native and everything else here. Thanks so much for having me, and yeah, I think next up is Evan Bacon.
All right. What's up, everyone? I'm Evan Bacon. I am the manager of developer tools at Expo, and today I'm extremely excited to show you guys some of the stuff that we've been working on that will revolutionize the way we build and deploy mobile applications. So right off the bat, I want to talk about our advancements in app deployment. Now, Expo is the easiest way to get your app into the hands of users. With EAS Build, you can submit your React Native app binary to the App Store, zero config, in a single line in the terminal. And this will get you as far as your app processing in the stores. But there's, you can't actually submit your app until you fill out all of this metadata and upload all of your screenshots, get an app review, all of which is done through an immeasurably slow website. I mean, it doesn't even measure the performance. It's quite slow. So, is there a better way? And there is. Charlie just mentioned it. It's EAS metadata, which we are extremely, extremely excited about. We've been trying to get this into production for a very long time, and it's finally coming. So with EAS metadata, users will finally be able to automate the entire Apple App Store submission process from the command line. You never have to leave. You can automate everything. Users can define their App Store metadata through a brand new file called the store.config.json, and this can be generated based on any existing apps in the App Store, which means it's incredibly easy to get started right away. Your metadata and screenshots can then be uploaded to the App Store through EAS CLI in a single command. And having local metadata means we can add features like live metadata linting, which can instantly warn you from your editor if your app is using language that is known to cause an App Store rejection, which ultimately saves you days of time in App Store review, which is also pretty awesome. Very excited. It gets better. So localizing all of your metadata from that App Store web UI is extremely slow and difficult work, and it often results in apps only being released in the region where they were built, by the developer who built them. And this means you're only releasing to a subset of your users. With EAS metadata, you'll be able to run your metadata through actions using JavaScript. This can enable custom features like automated changelogs, white labeling, or even localizing all of your metadata for every app store, which effectively means that you can deploy your app globally and reach all users in an instant, bringing mobile app development even closer to the web than ever before. So this is going to be released in beta in the next few days, and then the more advanced functionality will be coming in stable releases, and we're super excited about this. Great work to Cedric Van Putten, who we actually met at the last App.js Conf, and now he's building our Keynote features, so it's a very exciting time. Now, next, I want to talk about app development. We've been building tools for developing apps for years now, and all these tools ended up in the Expo CLI. We have stuff for bundling, cloud services, a lot of utilities, but this has turned it into a very monolithic and very large package, which has led to some inconveniences, like it takes forever to install it locally. And also, If there's any sort of change that happens to any tool, we have to update all tools at once. So if people have used Expo, they're probably very intimately familiar with this dialog here, and this will all be going away, because the next logical step is to split up the CLI in a way that scales better and more accurately for your needs. So over the last year, we've done just that. We've created a brand new versioned Expo CLI and a new bootstrapping command, create Expo app, which is the fastest way to get started. So now instead of installing a global CLI, you can simply run create Expo app, which is very fast. Just get started, very simple interface. And this is actually 60% faster and 150 times smaller than the other bootstrapping methods, which is really great for lower-end devices or areas where you have less good network connection, just making it substantially easier and more powerful to create apps. And let's also talk about this new versioned CLI that will be ultimately replacing Expo CLI in the coming months. So the version CLI, your dev tools will now live inside of each and every application. This is really great for CI because it means that there's less configuration required up front, improved caching, just a lot easier. And it's very reliable. So in the past, or today, if you have a global CLI and you have very old apps that you leave for a few years and you come back to, the global CLI will have to be downgraded in order to make those run. But now you can leave your app for years and come back to it working exactly as expected, which just is a massive leap forward in backwards compatibility, which is something that we strive to bring to native in the same way that it's been brought to web. But in order to do this, we had to rewrite the entire CLI, making it 2 times smaller with twice as less dependencies so that it's just more robust. And instead of running Expo Start, you'll now run npx Expo Start. And this is coming in SDK 46, so next month. And you can use it today with the beta flag if you want to get started trying it out. And what's really, really exciting about this is this has been blocking a lot of functionality and features that we've been trying to push for a very long time. Expo has been pushing advancements in native bundling for years now, but all of our advancements have all been out of tree. They haven't been upstreamed into what people use on an everyday basis. So going forward, we can now start to really push the boundaries of bundling. One example of this is universal metro bundling, which provides fast refresh from the same server across iOS, Android, and web. Metro Web is a substantially better way to actually debug and test Metro because you have all the same browser functionality tools. You can see network requests. So it's just it's a substantially nicer developer experience. And this is not edited. This is all live. They update all at the exact same time. It's quite magical. We also have something called exotic mode, which has been out for a few months. Now, exotic mode is an advanced bundling technique that we use to bundle 2 times faster than the default Metro settings. This just uses a lot of advanced techniques and capabilities, but this is something that you currently have to opt into. With the new version CLI, we can just enable it for everyone by default. It also is able to provide 18% smaller binary or bundles, which just means better tree shaking, faster time to interactive, better over-the-air updates. And something I am extremely, extremely excited about is that we will be bringing React Suspense to native development going forward. This is just going to be extremely nice for your development workflow. You can use the lazy and the suspense syntax from React, which web developers have had for years. And this is great for React navigation, which has first-class support for async components. And take this, for example, we are able to defer bundling of certain components until they're requested and loaded on the screen. Over here, you can see Metro bundles those components as we request them, which means if you have a giant component with something like Three.js or Moment, some massive library, it won't be bundled until you request that screen. So as your app gets larger and larger for enterprise, you'll be able to still move very quickly like you did when the app was much smaller. So we're really excited about that. Now, going back to the Expo CLI migration, this is the current interface for Expo CLI. There's a lot of commands there. This is the new interface for the version CLI. It's a lot more refined, but most of the commands have already moved over to EAS CLI, where we've continued to iterate on them with things like EAS build, submit, metadata, and update. But one thing that you'll notice is gone is eject. As Charlie mentioned, eject is completely gone. I've got a nice little animation for that. We're very excited about this. Eject is completely gone, and we've replaced it with pre-build. Now, all modern Expo projects go through pre-build, which converts them into basically just native apps, which means you can use your app with any native tooling, any native CI that you want. At any point, you can drop out. But just like how NPM can be configured to generate node modules in your app with the package JSON, in Expo, you can use the pre-build command to configure how your iOS and Android folders will be generated using the app.json, and you can regenerate them. This is incredibly great for upgrading React Native, because at any point, your app can just be regenerated, and upgrading is just as easy as it is in web now. And if at any point you want, you can jump into the folders, modify the code, just like with node modules, except you kind of lose out on the ability to rerun the pre-build command. I mean, you always could. You just risk overwriting your local changes. So this is all powered by config plugins. Charlie mentioned config plugins in depth, so I'm just going to skim over it really quickly. But these are a very well-defined and widely adopted specification for customizing the pre-build process. Simply put, config plugins are JS functions which modify native project files like the info plist or the Android manifest, so you can do things like add permissions to your application. So library authors, like maybe React Native Camera, can say, we need the camera permission, and all you have to do is install the package, and it sets everything up for you automatically. If you were to consider something very, very complicated, like Detox for Android, which provides EDE testing, this can now be tested, versioned, and developed once by the library maintainer, and then you as the user just need to install and add the plugin, and all of the lines of Markdown you don't even need to read them anymore. So it's extremely nice, very reliable, which we're just super excited about. And this also goes outside of the bounds of React Native, which is really great. Complex native functionality like multi-target iOS applications. Just for an example, you have iMessage stickers. You can just configure these in JSON. When you run pre-build, it will generate the entire new target in your iOS application from scratch. So this is stuff that is fairly difficult to do just in plain native code, and you can do it in a couple of lines using this new JSON format. And we're really excited to push this. It's being developed all the time by lots of people, so we're very excited here. Now, pre-build and EAS build are actually pretty agnostic of each other. Pre-build lets you convert a React Native app or an Expo app into just a native app, which you can use with any tool. An EAS build works with any native app. It doesn't require Expo at all. But when you use these two tools together, you can do incredible amounts of automation. Just as an example, here's how you set up Apple authentication. It's a real quick skim over. None of this has anything to do with writing JavaScript or native code. It's all related to code signing and some additional localization. This is how you would normally do Apple authentication when you're not using pre-build, when you're not using EAS build. When you are using EAS build, this is all you have to do. Because everything, the config plugin will tell it how it needs to code sign, and then EAS build will handle all of the code signing automatically, which means that you get to focus entirely on the development, and you can completely ignore all the code signing, which is, awesome. All right, so app development's really tricky, and config plugins are not the answer for everything. They simply automate a part of the stack that had never been automated before, the native configuration. But what about the native code, right? Now, some people will do something called a dangerous modification with config plugins. This is a regex that is widely used to add a single line to the app delegate. We highly recommend against doing this, but it's done fairly often. The reason we recommend against doing it is it reduces the longevity of your project and makes it harder to upgrade. For instance, if in React Native 68, for example, they changed from appdelegate.m to appdelegate.mm, now the app delegate is different, and this breaks down. So how do you write native code in Expo apps? We got this great developer experience for everything else. What is our developer experience like for native code in Expo? And to answer that question, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Tomasz Sapeta from the Expo and Platform team in Software Mansion.
So hi, everyone. I'm Tomasz. I'm a tech lead on Expo SDK development, and I work in the Expo team at Software Mansion. Let's look at how Expo modules pick up where config plugins leave off. And then we'll learn more about what Expo modules can do. As Evan said, config plugins are not always good and safe solution for every problem. Modifying the native code through a config plugin might be dangerous and cause conflicts when multiple libraries want to modify the same part of code. The most common transformations that we've found the developers to want to make with config plugins are to modify the app delegate on iOS or the main application and main activity on Android to hook into Android lifecycle. This is because many libraries need to be able to respond to certain system events, such as inbound links, notifications, or foregrounding and backgrounding the app. On iOS, React Native doesn't provide any mechanism to hook into app delegate methods. And so the setup instructions for React Native libraries often include instructions to copy code into your app delegate file. To simplify and automate this process, we've made a mechanism called Expo app delegate subscribers that allows your library to subscribe to the calls of app delegating functions. In order for this to work, the app delegate must only inherit from Expo app delegate, which forwards their calls to all the subscribers. Here is an example of the app delegate that is used in React Native Google Sign-in. It helps to handle the callback URL after signing in. This approach doesn't need a config plugin nor any dangerous mods that could break the behavior when multiple libraries hook into the same delegate function. And on Android, it uses main application and main activity for the similar purpose. Here is an example of React activity listener that lets React Native branch initialize on startup and then handle new intents by calling into React Native branch module. All without dangerous mods and changing applications code. It's the Expo modules auto-linking that is responsible for setting up their lifecycle subscribers. Speaking of auto-linking, we've recently optimized their entire script for auto-linking. In the Expo repository, it's 10 times faster than React Native community auto-linking, even though it needs to pass through 4 times as many packages. Oh, sorry. Bridge modules. Moment. Before we talk more about the features of Expo modules, let's take a step back and ask why this API exists. The standard React Native bridge module concept is simple and easy to understand and works well with asynchronous remote debugging. But it has limitations that have forced great libraries like Reanimated, React Native Skia, or React Native Vision Camera to start relying on JSI. And bridge modules will be deprecated in the future in favor of the turbo modules. And turbo modules are a part of the new architecture of React Native. They solve some problems that bridge modules had at the cost of some additional complexity. The main downside of the turbo modules is that they add another low-level language to the stack. As we all React Native developers, we use JavaScript, like high-level JavaScript on the daily basis, and we are rather reluctant to write C++ code, which is like on the opposite side of the spectrum in terms of the languages. And including C++ code in the library has a negative impact on the build time, especially on Android, and it can be also difficult to debug. And we would like Expo modules to be like turbo modules, but with Swift and Kotlin instead of C++. and all without flow and codegen. So Swift and Kotlin are powerful and expressive, and let us provide the best possible developer experience. Our team needs to maintain a large set of libraries, and maintaining native modules over time became like in a constantly changing environment is very expensive for us. An important goal is to create a module system that reduces the costs and technical debt to a minimum. One of the difficulties of writing React Native modules is context switching between vastly different languages and paradigms for writing native modules on each platform. Due to the differences between those platforms, it cannot be completely avoided. But we feel the need to have just one common API and the documentation to simplify the development as much as possible and make it easier for a single developer to maintain a library on multiple platforms. So I'm so happy to announce a new and reinvented API for writing native modules in Swift and Kotlin that me and other folks from Software Mention have been working on. It's called Sweet API. Here is a simple example of a module written in Kotlin. It exports the pi constant and returns a random integer. As you can see, the module is composed from the components in the definition function. The first function, the React getRandomInt, runs synchronously on the JavaScript thread, and the async function, getRandomIntAsync, runs asynchronously on a custom thread, which can be also set to the main thread. Now let's see the same implementation in Swift. Can you spot the differences? Thanks to the DSL-like syntax, it looks very similar on both platforms. The differences are very subtle and like only on the language level. Therefore, I will use only Swift on my next slides. Expo modules provide an abstraction on the JSI, and basically the resulting JavaScript object representing the module mirrors the native definition. And you can call the methods directly from application code. We've measured that calling an async function is 2 times faster than through the bridge. It's mostly the result of using JSI and not having to serialize the arguments. What is even more amazing is calling a synchronous function is incredibly fast and up to 20 times faster than calling an async function of the bridge module. Also, one of the big pain points that we've encountered over the years is the validation of arguments passed from JavaScript to native methods. This is a common source of bugs in our code. A valuable feature of the new module API is that it has near complete knowledge of the argument types expected by the function. So we can easily validate and convert the arguments for you. Let's imagine that we want to write a native function that loads an image from the given URL or the local path. To support local path, we'll need to normalize the path to the URL to accept strings, with or without the file scheme prefix. And convertibles are the native types that can be initialized from a certain specific kinds of data received from JavaScript. Such types are allowed to be used as an argument type in the function's body. In the above example, we perform a simple normalization, but this is easy to forget to do, and if you have to manually do it every time, and convertibles give us a clean, expressive interface for performing these routine operations. Some common iOS types from core graphics and UI kit frameworks are already made convertible, and we will keep adding more as we migrate Expo SDK modules to use the Swift API. Validating and converting arguments from JavaScript is especially painful when it comes to dictionaries, where each entry needs to be validated and converted separately. If you've written a native module before, you have probably written code like this. This is not very good. For example, if we look at the quality variable, we aren't even sure that it's actually a number because of Objective-C dynamic nature. And if you want to validate this, it would take extra code. This looks a bit better, but everything is still optional. Our type is not very expressive, and it's a bit hard to read. How can we improve this? We can improve it by using records. And here, the pick image options is our record. And instead of using the untyped dictionary values, you can write your own struct that will not only make them convenient to use, but also perform validations automatically. We can further refine this type because we know that the media types field can only be one of the three values: images, videos, or all. This is a perfect fit for an enum. And that's a record in the Suite API. To summarize, now in the functions body, we are sure that the options are properly typed and validated. And also, it works perfectly with auto-completion of your editor. And there is no chance that the typo will go unnoticed. For optional fields, the default values are already provided. And the function fails early when an unexpected value is passed. And it's also easy to keep in sync with the equivalent type in TypeScript. The next exciting feature in the Suite API is a native class. One of the problems with React Native modules is that all exported methods are placed in one static object. Not everything you can do in JavaScript can be mirrored by the native module. Web standards and Node.js often make use of classes to offer an intuitive API for stateful APIs. Expo module definitions make it possible to create fully object-oriented modules with natively created JavaScript classes that have their own property getters, setters. In this example, there will be no sand.js file in your project. Its implementation is part of the runtime, and it would entirely live in your native code. Another powerful feature that is available in our new API and other JavaScript runtimes, but isn't it possible to most developers in React Native, is typed arrays. JavaScript typed arrays are array-like objects that provide a mechanism for reading and writing raw binary data in memory buffers. When we pass a non-typed JavaScript array to the native code, it needs more memory allocation and has to be converted to the native type, which happens in the linear time. And JavaScript engines perform optimization so that these arrays are pretty fast. They share the same memory by native and JavaScript runtime, so that they would let us manipulate big raw binary data without additional memory allocation and in an optimized way. It opens the way to make new functionality that hasn't been possible in React Native without degrading the performance, such as audio, camera frame processing, or complex cryptographic operations. Bridge modules, turbo modules, and JSI don't support typed arrays yet. And Expo modules will support typed arrays by default. If you are worried that you will need to adopt your library to Fabric to make it work with the new React Native architecture, we have good news. All Expo modules will use Fabric without additional any piece of C++ or Flow code. The work on native JavaScript classes and typed arrays is still ongoing, and when it's done, we are going to redesign some of our Expo packages to take the advantage of these new features, which means making them more synchronous and object-oriented. I'm happy to announce that the first release candidate will be shipped next week. It will include everything I talked about in the presentation, except classes and typed arrays, which are still in development on Android. When the release candidate is out, you will be able to start creating your own Expo modules using one of the following commands, depending on which package manager you prefer. And the documentation is already partially available on the Expo docs page. I have to admit, I'm very excited how easy it is to write the documentation for the native models API, since the concept and ideas are the same on both platforms. And it's like read once and write everywhere. Thanks for listening. I will be happy to answer any questions here, in person, or on Twitter. I hope you will have fun at the conference.